As I say, we have another packed session today, so I'm not going to detain you with any opening remarks. I was trying to think about how to describe and categorise, summarise what we have in store today, but it's just impossible. There is so much variety, there is so many interesting things to talk about and panels to attend. So I will leave that to you and the programme to make your decisions about where you go. But to start us off, we have a very high-powered panel, which will, I think, match yesterday's opening session, although the bar was set pretty high yesterday. But I've no doubt that our panellists this morning are up to the task. And chairing the session this morning, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Amitabh Mattoo, who's a colleague of mine at the University of Melbourne. Amitabh directs the Australia-India Institute, which is an extremely important institute that the university supports, along with a number of other partners. Professor Mattoo is the director of the Australia-India Institute and a professor of international relations at the University of Melbourne. He concurrently serves as Professor of Disarmament Studies at the Centre for International Politics, Organisation and Disarmament at New Delhi's Nehru University. He was awarded the Padma Shri, one of India's highest civilian awards, for his contribution to education and public life. So you'll see that we are in very safe hands this morning, and at that point I will hand over to Amitabh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen, and many congratulations to you and the Melbourne School of Government for organizing this marvelous conference, and a warm welcome to everyone from me. As Helen said, today we have a really high-powered panel which is going to focus on China. We have two speakers, Professor Christine Wong, who is the Director for the Centre for Contemporary Chinese Studies at the University of Melbourne. Christine wisely moved from Oxford to come to Melbourne, where she was a professor of Chinese Public Finance and Director of Chinese Studies. She is taught at the University of Washington, University of California, University at Berkeley, at Mount Holyoke, and she has served in various high-level capacities at the World Bank, the OECD, and she is a member of the OECD Advisory Panel on Budgeting and Public Expenditure. And we have Professor David Kelly, who of course wisely moved from Sydney to Beijing. He is Research Director of China Policy, has lived in China for the last 10 years, has a PhD in Chinese Studies from the University of Sydney, but has worked with the ANU and with several institutions in Australia. Both Christine and David are going to speak for about 25 minutes each. Christine is going to really focus on how China revamped its public finance policies and how it's not all good news, while David will look at how policy is made in China and focus on a case study of pensions. They'll both speak for about 25 minutes each, after which we'll have a Q&A, and as Helen said, please feel free to tweet. The hashtag is MSOG Asian Century. Tweet your questions, and I will, during Q&A, read out some of those questions to our two speakers, but you're more than free to also raise questions during the Q&A without needing to tweet them. So may I first invite Professor Christine Wong to speak on public finance in China. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the real stuff, public finance. Apropos of yesterday's comments, I wanted to start with this graph about China's GDP, which grew from 1.2 trillion US dollars, this is by the official exchange rate, in 2000 to 8.23 trillion in 2012. I think what's really significant about these numbers is not these sheer magnitude, but the fact is that in when China started the reform process in 1978, China's GDP was equal to about 5% of the US GDP. And China began to grow rapidly from 1978 onward. In year 2000, China's GDP was 12% of the US GDP. In 2012, China's GDP was 52.2% of US GDP. Okay. In this century, China's GDP caught up to the US GDP at an unprecedented rate. And it is this trend in this century that's caught global attention. Right? And if you project forward from this trend, this is where you get the numbers about when China will cross the US to become the largest economy in the world. To save time, I'm going to skip over the rest of these economic numbers and move on to public finance. I think so the China's economic miracle story is pretty well known. I think it's less well known that during this period, there's been a resurgence of government. A resurgence actually requires an explanation. There was a decline, a very steep decline, as all other Soviet-type economies that had the Soviet model, when they began market reforms, their budgets typically collapsed. And that's for a very simple reason. They had rigged the system so that all the profits in the economy showed up in the industrial sector. So all the surplus from agriculture, mining, everything else were transferred through the price scissors to the industrial sector, where all industry was state-owned. So tax collection was extremely simple and easy. The government simply took the money. But when you begin to reform the economy and liberalize and allow private entry into industry, and prices adjust, SOEs collapse, their profitability disappears, government revenues collapse. And this happened in China. So in 1978, the government captured 31% of GDP for its budgetary expenditure. By 1990, it was 13.5% of GDP. Sorry, that's in 2000. At the trough, actually, government expenditures fell to 11% of GDP. So government basically shrank to 1/3 of its former size in this very steep decline period. But since 1996, government revenues have been recovering very robustly. So during the 2000 to 2012, government revenues have been growing at much faster than GDP. And that's why you get a climbing of the share of GDP that's being spent by government. But government also took the opportunity over the last 10 years to increase expenditures on social services and put money into infrastructure. Okay, let me come back to, so these were just numbers. I want to talk about the system of public finance. It matters because how government raises money influences how people behave economically, where you invest. How much money it can raise can determine how much government can do. How money is spent allocates the benefits of public spending, and how allocative decisions are made tells us, who is making these allocations and for whose benefit. All of these have critical effects on economic, political, and social outcomes that affect economic growth prospects, as well as income distribution and wealth. And in China, there are 5 levels of government, which greatly complicate these public finance decisions. As we know, China has been reforming now for 35 years. And they've been doing it incrementally, gradually. And on the whole, it looks to be very successful. And Chinese call this process crossing the river by groping for stones. From the outside, it usually looks like putting out fires. So in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to give you a brief glimpse of this journey in the fiscal system and to give you an assessment of China's progress to date and the challenges it faces. And I'm going to focus on urban municipal finance to illustrate the problems of incremental reform and how the fiscal system has affected all of those allocative decisions that I mentioned earlier. China's been urbanizing In 2010, China officially became an urban nation when 50% of the population were now living in cities. During the this century actually, from the census in 2000 to 2010, 211 million people were added to the urban population. And the biggest cities grew by 45%. So Shanghai went from 16 million to 23 million, and Beijing grew by 45% to now nearly 20 million. The challenge for public finance is that when cities grow, you have to provide infrastructure. You have to pay for more services to serve more people. So it's really how they do it matters, and it's also for developing countries, can they do it? How do they come up with the money? The 1980s to early 1990s were I call them the formative years for municipal finance, because that's essentially when the present system evolved and became set. And this is the period, as I mentioned, of fiscal decline when the budget was falling steeply. During this period, the system became decentralized. Higher level governments said, we don't have enough money, so let's allow the local governments to pay for more of these things that higher level governments used to pay for. So responsibilities got pushed down to lower levels, to local governments. During this period also, China began to reform the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, and restructure them. And in this process, they separated the state-owned enterprises from the government financial accounts. And in the process, the enterprises shed many of their quasi-fiscal responsibilities, providing housing, providing education, a very important one, providing pensions for workers, providing jobs for unneeded workers as kind of the quasi-unemployment program or employment program, and so on. And when these were separated from state enterprises, they fell on local governments and usually municipal governments. So the combination of urbanization and reform and fiscal decline put extraordinary pressure on municipal budgets. Okay. Yet during this period, fiscal reform made no accommodation to the growing expenditure needs of city governments. Okay. If you go back and read the reform literature for how they designed the tax sharing system implemented in 1994, there was no mention of cities. Okay. It's just central government and local governments. And then over the last 10 years or so, when revenues began to recover, the government has made huge efforts to assist county, rural governments. Okay, there's been a big program to tilt toward the rural, but still no official attention on cities. So the neglect of cities officially has continued. Very harsh fiscal conditions, but we know that Chinese cities have done very well. They've grown, they've thrived, they've all built enormous world-beating infrastructure, very impressive superhighways. You fly into any major city in China, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, you zip into town on these expressways. Everywhere you go, you have subway systems, you have water systems, you have much prettier schools, you have new hospitals, etc., etc. So cities have somehow done it. And in fact, overall, if you look at China's infrastructure, China is ranked 27th in the world in the World Bank's 155 countries that they rank for logistics performance. Okay. Logistics performance is an index of how efficiently a country gets its goods into the global system, global trading network. Big countries like China usually don't do very well. Poor countries don't do as well, and China has done extremely well, and this has been a very rapid catch-up. So the big question is, how have they done it? How has this urbanization been financed? off budget. Cities have not received much help in the formal system of public finance, so they've reached out and got money where they could. So they collect user charges, various levies that are often unrelated to services provided. So McDonald's in Beijing pays a fee, or used to pay a fee, I don't know if they still do, for anti-aircraft defense, and so on and so forth. I'm sure they paid a fee for the Olympics, contributing to the Olympics. Local governments also derive revenues from selling or leasing state assets. And of course, by far, the biggest state asset city governments own is land in China. They've created social security funds to pick up the expenditures of these pensions and unemployment and healthcare that have been moved onto their accounts, and they borrow through various channels. Okay. And in fact, if you talk to municipal officials, all they want to talk about is infrastructure, how much infrastructure they've created and invested in. And all of this is financed, or almost entirely financed, from land revenues and from borrowing. Borrowing is not that straightforward in Chinese cities because they're not allowed to borrow. The budget law says local governments cannot borrow. So they create these enterprises, they create these vehicles to borrow on the government's behalf, and they coordinate the infrastructural construction and so on. So typically, local governments acquire farmland as the cities expand, and they turn the land over to a platform. I call them LICs, local investment corporations. They can be called any number of names, Guangzhou Investment, blah, blah, blah. The LIC then takes the land as collateral and uses it to borrow money from banks. Okay. With the money, then the LIC can undertake the land preparation, paving roads, laying pipelines for water, sewage, and so on. And once the land is prepared, they sell it to developers to build residential, commercial, industrial stuff on it. Okay. And they turn over, the profits are then turned over to local government. Local governments then can go out and buy some more farmland, do the same thing again. Well, these revenues have proved very tempting, especially because Chinese law says only local governments are allowed to buy farmland and convert it to non-farm use. So they get no competition on that front. And the law also sets the price of this farmland at multiples of the 5-year yield on this farmland. Again, set at very low and artificially fixed prices to ensure that land preparation and selling to development is very profitable. So guess what? It's very tempting and unstoppable. In fact, I think the revenues now account for about 1/3 of municipal revenues nationwide. So for some cities, it's much higher. Cities have thrived, essentially, under a policy of benign neglect, where backdoor practices such as LICs have been tolerated. Remember, local governments are not allowed to borrow. They borrow through the LICs, and the central government knows that they're doing this, and they turn a blind eye. And you played a very useful role. I mean, I make no mistake, China's growth would not have been as high. Chinese cities would not look so modern, and Chinese urbanization would have hit many bumps along the way as people get overcrowded, there's not enough water, rubbish is piling up in the streets, and not enough capacity to move them, and so on and so forth. LICs have helped local governments to ease their financing bottleneck that the fiscal system itself was not able to solve. But they also opened the soft budget constraints for local governments. They operated largely unsupervised. They certainly were unsupervised from higher levels. And the interplay between local government access to land and LICs led to far too much land taking, too many LICs, and too much borrowing. Okay, so many cities are now over-leveraged and in danger of not being able to service their loans. The ready availability of funding through this kind of, rolling over the land and building more led to far too many wasteful and inefficient investments and contributed to urban sprawl. This is a very nice spread that appeared in the Financial Times in August from Guiyang, the capital city of Guizhou province, the lowest income province in China in the west, in the western region, hilly, very, very poor place. This is a set of apartment buildings that are half finished, shop fronts that are unfinished. This is a further away view of this complex. And it's just heartbreaking, These buildings go as far as the eye can see. Guiyang is not the only city. Every city in China has stuff like this. Guiyang is the provincial capital. If you go down to second-tier, third-tier cities, you will see similar phenomena all over China. And this is what the central government is very worried about. And this is what the third plenum, which just finished, this central party committee that met to discuss reform strategy for the next 10 years, this is what they're worried, very worried about, and talking about how China needs to come up with a new strategy, needs to fix these fundamental problems. The outcomes here can be attributed, I think, to a severe mismatch between the assignment of responsibilities to municipalities through this incremental reform process, the mismatch between responsibilities and revenues, and the lack of right to borrow. Okay. In order to invest in long-term infrastructure, public finance theory says it's both efficient and fair in terms of intergenerational fairness to borrow, because you want to stretch out the repayment period to match the benefit period, right? To build a bridge takes 3 years. Even in China, it takes 3 years. In Britain, I think it takes 20 years. But it's unfair to make the current taxpayers bear the whole bill, while future taxpayers will benefit from this bridge that they can drive on, right? So if you borrow and you match the term of your borrowing to the benefit period, then that would be much more fair. In China, it's been the growth imperative that's led the central government to turn a blind eye. They know that local governments are doing things that they're not supposed to do, but they're producing growth. They're producing outcomes that are consistent with the national objective, right? So as long as they're not doing anything really terrible, criticize the party, they can keep going. But the costs are not very low, because this kind of patched together fiscal system with very distorted incentives have led to a huge amount of waste. Like this. You've led to urban sprawl in China. It's led to a very intensive energy and raw material incentive kind of growth that Ross Garnaut was talking about. That's benefited Australia disproportionately over the last 10 years. Right? This is the picture of what's made Australians so rich. But Australia would like to see China get on a more sustainable path, right? So that we can also, here in Australia, enjoy the continuing wealth that can be produced. Okay. The fixes proposed in the third plenum. Oh, my hearing was here. Okay. 2 more minutes. are to rebalance central local assignments to match responsibilities with revenues and allow local governments to borrow for capital spending. They want to rein in the LICs and land finance, strengthen financial management of fiscal resources, including making budgets more transparent. The problem with financing off budget, when local governments got revenues from selling land, until 2007, they didn't have to report to anyone. They didn't even have to report at the municipal level very often. In 2007, the central government said, you now have to put the land revenues in your treasury accounts. And there was an audit conducted in 2009 of 11 cities. I can't remember all who they are, but Guangzhou, Beijing, and so on, and found that land revenues were underreported by 70% in those cities. So it's a long road back. Putting Humpty Dumpty back together again, can they do it? Weaning local governments off land. They're deriving 1/3 of their revenues from land, and you say, stop. And they're borrowing through LICs with this land, and you want them to stop. How low is China going to allow growth to go? We've heard that China's growth is very investment-driven. Investment is very much driven by local governments, especially municipal governments. To slow down this train is quite painful. There's a mountain of local government debt that will likely need to be bailed out, resolved. And we don't know how big this mountain is. There were no audits of LICs and local government debt from 1978 to 2011. In 2011, they finally thought, wait a minute, we need to find out. So a nationwide audit was ordered, and they found 10.7 trillion yuan in local government debt, about 25% of GDP. And the IMF had to raise China's public debt by some large amount. But even so, immediately people said, no, the mission for the audit office was too narrow. They were only looking for debt for which local governments had provided guarantees. So let's look at all debt. So there's been a third round that's concluded in October. We haven't seen the report yet. Imposing comprehensive oversight of extra budgetary revenues is absolutely essential for China to manage its macroeconomy. At the moment, no agency has that. So, but these are some short-term fixes. There has to be a longer-term strategy where, after 3 decades of rapid growth and structural change, the Chinese economy has absolutely outgrown its fiscal system. When you look at what the expenditure needs are, well, 30 years ago, China was less than 20% urbanized. Today, it's 53% urbanized. Right. Needs change when people move to the cities. Both horizontally, that is across sectors and across regions, expenditure needs have shifted. But vertically, there's been some changes. Does it make sense for the central government to be allocating more than 50% of the budget while delegating all the responsibilities to lower level governments and then making transfers to reach the lower levels? Rebalancing intergovernmental assignments will require a very thorough reassessment of these expenditure needs to guide a comprehensive reform going forward. It doesn't mean that China has to have a big bang reform, again, in the fiscal sector, but it needs to have a roadmap that can guide what the next steps are and to set a timetable for reaching these solutions. And that's the only way China can be put back on a sustainable fiscal path to support the realization of the Asian century. Now, one last thing is that as an economist, I have a rather simplistic notion of the Asian century, and that is simply the center of economic gravity. You know, as China reaches 50% of U.S. GDP, it reaches 2/3, it reaches 3/4, plus India, its weight of the world GDP. The overall world GDP, you know, plus Japan, you know, is likely to be shifted or has shifted to Asia in this century, and it's likely to continue. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for bearing with me, and let me say what a great privilege it is to be here. What a great delight. And it's an honor to be at the inaugural conference of this kind. I come from a background in Chinese studies, but I made a sort of crossover to policy studies about 10 years ago, working in Singapore in the East Asian Institute. I've got about 20 slides to get through, and I budgeted it on about 20 minutes, so I've got to do about one a minute. They're not of all the same complexity, but I suggest that I step through them at a good pace, and that we can come back to discuss any detail. My interest in this presentation is not to continue with the excellent outline that we've just had from Professor Wong. That's a really fine statement of the policy dilemma of the moment, and there's nothing there that I can disagree with. But what I want to show is something stepping back a level as to and going into how we deal with learning, studying, building knowledge about policy in China. So since becoming a policy sort of researcher, I've got involved in a company called China Policy, where I help direct 4 teams that look at 4 big sectors of the policy environment. We look at governance and law, we look at finance and economy, we look at social policy, and we look at energy resources and climate change. And I'll take one particular policy theme as a case study. First of all, let me step through. Is that clear to the audience? I'll step through some of the basic furniture of the policy environment. Some of this will be like Chinese Politics 101, so bear with me if that's all very familiar to you. Power in China lies with the party. The party, however, cannot do everything and outsources a great deal of its programs, its social, political, economic programs, to the government. The political power is conceived in a constitution, however, as if the party was sort of not present. And you see, so a hierarchy of constitutional statutory organizations, agencies, the National People's Congress, the State Council. These are the ones that are most important for the discussion today. As implemented, we see a Chinese Communist Party which has party and state and central military commissions, and then has, as an expression of its remit, the State Council. The State Council does the work the party needs to have done. It builds the schools, it builds the roads, collects the taxes, it runs the education, health systems, etc. So the key decision maker, too fast. Go back, please. Previous. The key decision making. It's not a Macintosh. I've got to keep clicking the arrow, and I've got to use the arrow keys. That will solve everything. Sorry. So we have a party structure, the red pyramid, and we have the state structure. Of course, many people are on both of them. People wear two hats. You can have a party hat and a government hat. And the way your party role is connected to your government role is very variable. The Premier, Mr. Li Keqiang, is also ranked number 3 in the Communist Party Politburo, and so forth. And there's a lot more that could be said about that, and we can come back to that. Now I want to come to how we conceive of policy within this. And I'm building a model here that is largely constructed from the Chinese language. And as I'll be stressing, the Chinese primary source language is very important to actual day-to-day research on China, because many concepts which seem on the surface to be identical in meaning actually have a different frame of reference behind them. And we've had a discussion of this in other contexts in this conference. I remember a comment yesterday in Indonesia, regarding Indonesia, that certain things have the same lexical meaning but refer to a different social reality. And that is a core issue for us. So in the Chinese policy discourse, we can make out a realm in which policy is debated. Many people think of China as a one-party state with a dictatorial propaganda system, etc. And it is. There's a very powerful monopoly exerted in the public sphere by the party state. Nonetheless, policy is actively debated. It's not debated at every twist and turn of the policy process, however. We can talk about certain policies as policy orientations. The Chinese expression is fangzhen. Policy orientations are generally the preserve of the leadership, and they are generally not debated. If for example, one of the key examples is the doctrine of non-interference in foreign policy. Nobody really seriously gets up and says that China must interfere or that this policy should be disturbed. Such policies often are labelled and publicly announced. At the lower level, another level which is not very actively debated is what we're calling policy measures. These are often simply enacted. They are the result of a local decision by a local agency. The fact that they're not debated is not so much that they're secret or highly, that they touch areas of security. It's just that the policy environment does not conceive of these as an area requiring debate. Sometimes they will be debated. They will often be flushed out to the surface by active investigative journalists or by people in the policy think tanks. But this is kind of fortuitous. There's nothing to say that this must happen. But it's this macro operational level is the interesting one, and I think this is the basis for constant and consistent policy research, and that is what we call macro operations. These are publicly announced, and a cardinal example is what Professor Wong just referred to in the third plenum. The third plenum is a macro operational level of research, and it is it has come about after a very active debate, as I hope to show you. So there was a top-level fangzhen, or orientation, and that is associated with the rhetorical expression of the Chinese dream. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but you can see here that the leader of the Communist Party, who is also the president of the PRC in state terms, is talking about making the country affluent and strong, the nation vigorous and the people happier. Let's get a glass of water. And at the same time, the state premier, who is the head of the government structure, is talking about, oh, I've done it again. No. You've got to click on the right arrow to go back. Sorry. Shot ahead of me. Yes, reform is a driving force. So there's a difference in tone here. One is setting a very aspirational goal, and the other is talking about problem solving. Let us move on. These are some of the policies, what I was saying at the macro operational level. And I think we had them very clearly set out by Professor Wong. We could easily refer back to her paper to give a rather sharper picture than I've provided here. But among the terms that came up, marketization, urbanization, devolution of government functions, this also takes in that very important aspect of aligning responsibilities with fiscal powers. And what I want to emphasize here is not those policies themselves, but the environment in which they're developed. And here we see a feature of the Chinese policy environment. The central government does a great deal of outsourcing of this sort of policy. It is by no means all bound up behind closed doors in secret meetings. There is a very thriving undergrowth of think tanks and research institutions, university departments, and increasingly NGOs, Chinese NGOs, who develop policy as outsourcing targets of government. And in the process of developing these policies, the intellectuals and scholars, researchers involved in these agencies publish furiously. They publish daily more than we can read, more than most people could try to read. The sheer volume of policy discussion that is generated in China is a very large term. This is in contrast to a country like Australia, where in fact outsourcing is rather rare. A great deal of policy development in Australia actually is announced after it has been developed within the agencies. So China is rather more like the United States in that way. And this is the basis of our work. This is why we can work in Beijing and try to track what is happening. It doesn't mean that the problem is simple. We have almost too much material to work with. And the filtering, sifting, eliminating of secondary cross currents and speculation is an issue. I mentioned there at the bottom of the slide our methodology. I'm not going to say too much about it because I want to show you it. Closely, systematically tracking policy discussions across core sectors, and I've mentioned those already. So let me now look at the sector that we've chosen as a case study. I won't be coming to any conclusions. I won't be offering policy suggestions. I just want to show you. I want to show you the roughness. I want to show you the kind of texture of this issue, and I want to show you that it is analysed in terms of of course the core issues which can be traced back to academic disciplines, to dealing with social security, economics, political economy, but we have to deal on a transactional basis every day with the fact that policy is produced by people. And a great deal of our effort is to work out who is speaking To whom are they speaking? What are they trying to get across to those people? People is a very important aspect of how we pursue this topic. Again, organizations, people work in organizations and their activities are limited or shaped by the organizational environment in which they work. It's different in a huge bureaucratic agency like the National Development and Reform Commission, which has come down from the planning system of the past. That's quite different from the Development Research Centre inside the State Council, which is very much a think tank. It's in many ways at loggerheads with that first organisation, the NDRC. So when people speak from this platform or that platform, that has a bearing on how we are understanding what they say. So people and organisations. And the third of the three wheels that we work with are the issues themselves. Issues are very hard to define, and I know that's been the subject of some other discussion at this conference. Issues, unlike people, breed like rabbits and leap around and fuse and differentiate and subdivide almost with a mind of their own. And I often compare the issues that occupy the Chinese policy world to a fractal system where each level seems to be equally complex as the level above, and so that there is a self-similarity of each level of policy discourse. And no matter how far you go down, you still seem to be meeting complexities and disagreements and the multiplication of issues. So let's look very quickly at the Chinese pension framework. We see that the state pension scheme disproportionately benefits government employees. That's the takeaway from this diagram. I hope you can all see the small print. You'll see there that there are, of course, voluntary pension programs. You can buy more pension coverage depending on your circumstances. Individuals can buy annuities and other forms of pension coverage, and there are increasingly complementary pension schemes operated by the employers. And in general, Social Security in China, the Social Security policy was strongly influenced by the World Bank in the late 90s and adopted the 3 pillars, which you're seeing here. But the basic pension scheme, which is statutory for all citizens, is itself internally hierarchized. There is a strong status distinction between government and public service units, between enterprise employees and civil society organizations. Then there are the unemployed, and unfortunately it's in green, the unemployed with rural hukou. Now hukou, we have not had this word before, I don't think, at this meeting. I think it's becoming a word in English. Hukou is the internal residence permit system that differentiates urban from the non-urban population. This is the biggest single source of inequality in China today. If you have an urban hukou, then you start to receive all those public goods that Professor Wong was talking about and which have expanded rapidly and admirably. If you're outside that system, however, your access is massively diminished. And the discussions in the policy realm about pension having, as we came up to the third plenum, increasingly focused on the inequality, in the inequity, the unfairness of a pension system in which the state is giving itself, essentially, and giving its own membership greater financial assistance as they retire. And I'll just give you a moment to read this. This is the point we're trying to make here, that you will see this discussed vividly in the policy literature. What we call the policy literature are generally highbrow, weekly, monthly, some daily media, reports from think tanks, websites, blogs, even the Twitter-like Weibo, the Chinese equivalent of Twitter. You will find that certain policy intellectuals have a vast following where these sort of comments are widely discussed. The point is often made that Twitter has a word limit, and so does Weibo. The word limit in Chinese, because of the structure, the nature of the Chinese language, allows far more analytical discussion. So within that small slug of text, people can really get into policy issues. And so this means that this platform has taken on a different role in China. The social networking is largely, not exclusively of course, but is to a greater extent than in the West, a vehicle of policy discussion. And here you see a lot of the subsequent discussions. You'll see a kind of a positive and a negative approach. I won't read them out. I hope they're readable, and I'm only seeking to give you the flavour and what I'm calling the roughness or the texture of this level of the policy environment. This is an example of policy analysis over a period of time. We can see this debate, these discussions in the policy debates influencing policy. We saw it particularly this year. This year was a particularly fascinating year from this point of view because we had the third plenum, which is setting the policy agenda for the next 10 years. So as the year went by, moves were made as if on a chessboard. A certain opening is made, a certain response is made, and then we saw decisions which reflected those. It's not the case that we could sit there and make 100% accurate predictions, and it's not the concern. It is not the aim of the process. It can happen in certain cases. You can see something coming, and you can give odds for it. But in general, what you're doing is saying that the policy discussion space is narrowing, and the solution space to that issue is becoming more definite and will be within a number of parameters. There will be certain things, it's either going to be that or that. And to be able to say that is already a great advance. Now I'm just going to step through these ones. These are some of the discrete issues within the pension debate. The housing for pensions emerged in September with a State Council opinion. Housing for pensions is often called a reverse mortgage. People who are in their elderly years, they no longer have dependents, but they have a house, can make this house a source of credit or a source of income. They get an income stream from it, and the house gradually, its value is expended. And people favour it or oppose it for different reasons. And here you see some of the plus points of view. We label them with a plus and a minus. You see that somebody from the Chinese National Real Estate Development Group Corporation. This is Mr. Meng Xiaosu, very prominent spokesperson on housing policy, supports it, and somebody else doesn't support it. I'll run through the rest of them. You'll see much the same, but this postponing the retirement age, plus and minus. Live debate between people with strong platforms. Take Li Chen, who is in the Renmin University. She's the director of the Renmin University Social Security Research Center. Powerful research intellectual who takes a prominent position, puts her name on the line. Enterprise annuities, we saw this, again, there's a kind of crescendo as we're coming up to the third plenum, which was held last month. The integrated pension system, pension fund investment in October. And I'm going to close at this point for considerations of time. I hope you've been able to see that there is a texture and grain, there is evidence which can be used to develop policy analysis. It does require dealing with the Chinese language, but once we're over that boundary, the policy environment is not all that different and is not all that alien. It is not decided by a black box sitting somewhere in the Zhongnanhai. It is thrashed out in public. But big problems remain. This is not to say that everything is sorted out on a rational basis or in a satisfactory way. And the pension discussion illustrates these key social divides: rural, urban, government and non-government, central, local. And that's my closing point. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine and David, for those riveting presentations. Depth of analysis, great overview. And I can see that lots of people have tweeted questions as well. But you're more than welcome to ask questions right now. So let's begin. Gentleman right here.
I hate to be the first one, but I just feel I really got to ask Christine.
And could you identify yourself, please?
Wang Huawei from Asian Development Bank. The whole world is watching, this conference is on Asia in the century, and the whole world is watching Asia, and particularly China. But China is at a very, very critical stage. There are many, many challenges, but I won't say equality is as serious as people think. It's coming down since 2003. Corruption is another huge problem. They may corrupt the society, the country, the party, but it's getting better since the new leadership. Environmental issues, I think they're coming to that. It's very bad, but I think they can tolerate. The two major problems hang on in so many people's mind. One is the local government debt you mentioned. Now, you said you don't really know the number. I think we're waiting. I don't know whether ever the central government will release the census on the local government debt. They did a census, which is unusual. People have all kinds of guesses from 10 trillion to 22 trillion, all that kind of numbers. But my question is not really asking you to come up with a number, is whether that issue might lead to a major crisis in China. But that's a critical issue, whether China can somehow manage to avoid, somewhat dilute that local government debt. It's going to be a problem, but really the key is whether that leads to crisis. I think that's very important.
Okay.
The second major problem, I think most people know, is the housing bubble. People looking at Japan and China say, if we're going to have this bubble, if the bubble is going to burst, then we're dragging down the Chinese economy, the whole world will suffer after USA and Europe, which would be tragic. But Chinese real estate market is so different. You mentioned you had all those pictures. We all know the ghost cities. Actually, the Wilson Center Kissinger Institute asked me to talk last year in November about housing bubble. I'm not really a housing expert. Fortunately, the U.S. government was shut down that period, so I did not really talk about. I did not really have to talk about it in D.C. But one thing is, you probably will know, when those housing price dropped about 30%, so the bubble actually bursted in one of the cities, and I was asking whether that were, the contentious were moved to other cities. It did not happen, not so far. So I want to ask you, you mentioned Guiyang, Erdos, and many other places, whether the bubble would burst and bring on the Chinese economy.
Thank you.
The final thing, as economists, is the thing is really the capital account. You may know some economists in China really worry about this, the possibility of the central government opening up the capital account, which they may lead to capital flight and really lead to the crisis in the Chinese economy.
Thank you.
So the three critical questions.
Christine, would you like to answer these and then may club a few questions together?
I'm happy to do it either way.
Avery, you had tweeted a question, so why don't you now tell us what you tweeted?
Maybe a bit of a silly question. I might have to
Could we have the microphone here, please? Yeah.
Avery Poole from the University of Melbourne. It might be a bit of a naive question, maybe I just missed something, but I was wondering if I found the talk by Professor Wong fascinating, particularly about urban sprawl in the poorer cities. But I just wanted to clarify something. The apartment buildings that are stretching as far as the eye can see that are unfinished, was that because of exhausting the LIC funds, or is it actually sort of overestimating, in a way, the population growth such that, or the income, disposable income of the population in those cities, such, would they actually be occupied if they were finished? I was just a bit unclear on that.
Okay, let's take one more. Yeah, gentleman here. Okay.
Mark Beeson, Murdoch University. Question for David. I was really interested in the discussion of the public ventilation of questions of public policy, the sort you described. What about the area of security policy? Do we get a similar kind of open debate in that particular area? And would you like to say something about the role of social media in that environment as well? The sort of nationalists egging on the government to take a firmer line with Japan, for example.
Okay, Christine first.
Yes, thank you for these questions. It's always nice to get questions because it means people were listening. On Guanghua's questions first, on local government debt, about 2 years ago, I was in Beijing and we had a small workshop in Tsinghua University where the current finance minister, Lou Jiwei, spoke and among the speakers. And it was attended also by his predecessor, Minister San Huaicheng. And we were talking about big reforms in the fiscal system, how likely that was going to be. And Minister Lou's position was that the central government is unlikely to undertake a comprehensive reform unless they were desperate. And he said he participated in the 1993 discussion leading up to the 1994 reform. He said the government was desperate then, it was running out of money. At the moment, he said there are no crises on the horizon. So I raised the issue of local government debt, whether that constitutes the next crisis. And he said, no, it's easy to handle that. And Minister Xiang, his predecessor, as we were walking to lunch, he took me aside and said, he's wrong. He's over-optimistic. I think the local government debt, we don't know what the number is. It's likely to be somewhere around 20 trillion, which translates to what, about 1/3 of GDP, 40% of GDP. That's roughly the amount of bailout of the non-performing loans in the late 1990s from the state-owned enterprises. And China absorbed it with no problem. Okay. But the difference between now and then was that China then hit a patch of super global economic growth and super exports, and Chinese economic growth accelerated. And so absorbing a 40% of GDP when your GDP is rising by double digits every year is not that big a deal. Going forward, China is not going to be growing that fast. The global economy is not going to support that. So that's one problem. The bigger problem is how to shut off the tap that produced this debt. since the audit report came out in since they ordered the audit to be undertaken in 2011, the government has said no more bank lending to LICs and no more local government guarantees of debt. And the banks have stopped lending. I mean, they've slowed down to a trickle. But then they created all these wealth management products. Shadow banking has grown by leaps and bounds. Okay, shadow banking is just extra financial system stuff. Just like, when the budget was shutting down the cities, they went off budget and created extra budgetary revenues. So this is what's really worrisome about what's happening, and is that the government doesn't have the controls over. It's like squeezing a balloon. You squeeze at one end, air goes out, and creates something else. On the housing bubble, David probably knows more about housing. He's watching it more closely on the ground. I want to say that I've been studying China for 30 years. For about 20 years now, I've been going around Chinese cities thinking there's a housing bubble. There are always these unfinished high-rises on the edges of town. And then the towns kept growing, and the edges, eventually, these half-empty buildings got finished as China was growing, and more people moved into the cities, and more demand was created for this housing. What happens now? Will this continue to happen? Will Guiyang double in size? Well, probably not, because if you look at the numbers, I said in the last 10 years, or between the 2000 and 2010 census, urban population grew by 211 million. That's a 46% share of the total urbanization over 30 years. Well, what happened? I think a lot of what happened in those 10 years was what the Chinese are now calling false urbanization, where city governments grabbed a lot of land and incorporated larger areas than they need. And indeed, for the World Bank study on urbanization, we went around and talked to a few cities in May. Everywhere we went, people were estimating that their urban growth, their population growth will be 8% a year without end. Nobody ever talked about possibilities of slowdown. Everybody is planning for this continuing uptrend. And so if you add that all up, everybody's thinking that they're going to be urbanizing at these rates, and they're overbuilding. What's our conclusion? Opening up capital accounts, yes, this seems to be a bad time for that. This is a reform that's been in the books for a long time, and I believe the central bank governor really wants to do it, but when your banks are a bit fragile, it's probably not a good time to open that up. And your question is related to the housing bubble question. Why all this unfinished housing? Probably oversupply, probably overestimation of how many more people will be moving in.
If I could just add a little to that, the empty housing establishments, the endless empty blocks of housing show, of course, the disengagement of market forces. Market forces you would expect to control wasteful building. You don't build something that you can't sell or that is not going to recover its costs. But here you see the disconnect. The people who are building the housing make money by building it. The money is made by the building of it and not by the living in it. And if you could connect those, then you would say, well, there's a market solution. But in the policy debates that I see, many people worry that won't even work because the private sector has already been distorted in its kind of calculations by working in a distorted marketplace. There are private sector builders, developers, who work in collusion with the government, and they make the money by the building as well. To wean them off this kind of negative, there's wealth destruction. In fact, it's wealth destruction. I think what that picture that Professor Wong showed of the scenery of Guiyang, that looks like wealth destruction to me. You've created a lot of concrete, and you've built a house. You've built a wall of urban sprawl, and the net costs of that must be very great. Where's the income? However, behind that is the fact that the population will continue to grow for some time, and there is a shortage of housing. There's a shortage of affordable housing. Those houses that housing that is being built is not affordable. That's a further turn of the non-market screw. So great is the disconnect between demand and supply, and between what the market actually needs and what will make money.
I think there was a question about whether on security policy there is as much transparency evident, because from my perspective, the Asian century is really like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll is the economic story of great success, where India and China will, after 200 years, again regain a preeminent position. But the Mr. Hyde is that Asia is resembling 19th century Europe in terms of territorial disputes, in terms of all the various solutions, in whether it's balance of power or the C word that no one wants to utter, containment. So how do you reconcile the economic success with the political problems of Asia? And in the context of how is security policy, was there a similar debate on this air defense policy that China has articulated recently?
Without wanting to go to every corner of that question, a few points. When the Philippines recently suffered a typhoon disaster, many countries stepped forward and made assistance, financial and other assistance. China did too, and encountered some criticism, but it certainly made a gesture. But before that gesture was made, the social media ran wild with something like over 250,000 messages from people, from the public, demanding that China not give the Philippines anything. These were, of course, the hyper-nationalists. They were probably young, unmarried men who would otherwise be drinking heavily, as they do in other countries. And the number, 250,000 in the population of China, is not all that significant. Every number is big in China. So you have to step back and think, we know that there is a large number of people who are influenced by government instruction and government information and propaganda, and who see the world from a particular point of view, who see China as having undergone two centuries of humiliation. This expression, the 2 centuries of humiliation, is characteristically uttered in the same breath as that expression, China Dream. When China Dream is mentioned in the media, it is often followed by, we are going to overcome the 2 centuries of humiliation. So this has been analyzed endlessly by scholars and all around the world and within China. And I see people in China who are equally aware that this is a kind of self-mortifying, self-humiliating, there's this kind of circular nature to this. We can't really do the kind of policy analysis on that. There is simply, as I said at the beginning, this area is not open to debate in the same way. the policy intellectuals here, and there are three big departments of international relations, which are Peking University, Renmin, and Fudan University. And I've heard their leadership at conferences and meetings. They will generally make the same statements that the government is making. They will generally defend something in the official line. The foreign policy is very consensual, in other words. It's dominated by consensus, whereas pension policy, housing, hukou reform, land, finance, these are open to massive debate. And for that reason, we don't find it very profitable to do the same kind of analysis. And so the analysis of foreign and security policy is best done from looking at what happens on the ground. You can study what is the impact, what China actually does. And so what Japan observes of China's actions, or Vietnam, Philippines, and all the neighboring countries and so on. That is how you approach that analysis rather than through the policy debate.
Okay. The gentleman here. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the talk. I'm Edward Buckingham from the University of Nottingham in Ningbo. I completely sympathise with your comment earlier that the buildings, if they're built, people will come. And we saw this in the 1990s. But what I'd like to perhaps to reflect on a little bit is what about the new generation that's coming through? Gordon Gekko in a recent film was quoted as describing the new generation coming through as having no income, no jobs and no assets. This is not a uniquely Chinese problem. But it's something that the government's focusing on. It looks as though the government is trying to develop regional banking in China, that is to say city banks and cooperative banks. And the big four banks are pulling out of the regional areas. Perhaps you've looked at this. Maybe you could share some comments.
Any other questions? Any questions which have been tweeted? Who's in charge of the dashboard on Twitter here? Okay. Then why don't you?
Well, on the, I don't know much about the regional banks versus the national banks, but on the issue of affordability of housing, the current, so China has 90% home ownership in the housing market, which is astonishing. It's probably too high. But in the big cities, I think 3/4 of the people who own their houses have acquired their houses under some kind of preferential policy, where if you were working for an enterprise that provided housing under the old regime, you had a chance to buy the flat you were living in at a very, very low price. And if you worked for governments continue to allocate housing through the mid to late 1990s. I know the Ministry of Finance continued to build housing and handing it out to their staff at very, very low prices until the early part of the noughties. So in other words, if this is true in most cities, that 2/3, 3/4 of the people own their houses having bought them cheap, they are now they're in a position to help the younger people coming into the cities to buy, with the relatives chipping in. I've asked in Beijing, how do young people come here and buy a flat when flat prices cost 100 times their annual salary, right? And the answer is, it's the 4 grandparents plus uncles and aunts chipping in to help them buy. Well, you run out of those. If the grandparents have already done it for one child, maybe 2 grandchildren, you run out of resources. So it's always looking forward. What happens? Eventually you're going to run into a block where people can't get into housing. China needs inflation.
we have about 3 minutes left. So, yes.
We have a question from Twitter for Professor Wong from IPA Victoria. Given off-budget borrowing by LICs and underreporting, how confident are you in the Chinese economic stats?
And it's not often that you have two such distinguished China experts on a single panel, but I want to move you beyond your comfort zones and ask a question, a 101 political theory question, which is that do you see any evidence of a real change within China's political system? Given the social churning that's taking place, do you see a greater democratization, demand for greater political choices, as there are choices in the market? Would people seek those greater choices? Is there a possibility of a Chinese Arab Spring? Professor Wong.
Let me answer the question about economic statistics. How reliable are economic statistics? Well, you know, how reliable are economic statistics of any developing country? China is not that bad, actually. You have to learn how to read the numbers. They may not be telling you what you think they're telling you if you read carefully what the definitions are and what's included and what's not included. On that, I think national statistics tend to be more reliable than subnational statistics. When it comes to local governments, anything goes, even populations. You know, they're playing all these games with population numbers. Whether they're now supposed to report permanent residence, which is everybody who's been living in that city for 6 months or more, including hukou and non-hukou. But depending on what they're reporting on, if they're reporting on per capita income, they like to use the hukou population only because that gives them a smaller base and a bigger number overall. So national data is better than local data, but overall it's probably not that bad. Is China going to change? Don't count on the middle class to push for it. I'm going to leave this question to David because he hasn't spoken for 2 minutes now.
Well, how long have I got? 2 minutes. I gave a paper recently on the controversy this year on the Constitution. This also came straight out of the statements made by Xi Jinping when he became the party leader. He said that now there was going to be, that everyone in power was going to be equal before the rule of law. He had to say this because he was dealing with Bo Xilai, the madcap party leader of Chongqing City, as a subject of a book by John Garneau, which you can buy locally, I think, The Fall of the House of Bo. This was a major crisis for the government. This was a non-cyclical event. Coming to power, Xi's come to power was a cyclical event, but behind it was this extremity where it seemed that there could have been a seizure of power. So everyone's equal before the law, and that's why he could take him down. So then immediately the liberal left and the liberals generally in China, who are a considerable proportion of the intellectual population, immediately said, oh great, let's have a constitution that really means something now. Let's really flesh the constitution out and make it really work. Of course, the constitution of 1982 provides a full range of citizen rights. It provides freedom of speech, it provides freedom of movement and so forth, all of which are then diluted by other considerations, by the need for national unity, the need to avoid social conflict and so on. So the constitution is essentially disabled by unspoken and spoken sub-rules, subsequent rules. So if you're going to make the constitution really valid, that you would see a big change in China. China would have changed immediately. It would look very different. There would be an end to extrajudicial arrests, for example. That is promised also in the current judicial reforms that are part of the third plenum. We haven't seen it happen yet. Also, other things, such as Angela Merriam will be discussing, I think, in a subsequent panel about the one-child policy, which is another major policy plank. Changes have been promised. If the Constitution was in effect, I don't think you could have a one-child policy. It is an abrogation of some human rights. But nobody would assume that the Chinese Communist Party is going to dissolve itself tomorrow. It would be a disaster for me because my computer system is based on it existing. I've built a way of a database that reflects a mono-organizational system, so it's not that I want it or don't want it, it just would change everything. The changes that are coming, that I think are significant, is essentially the pluralization of public opinion, massively pluralized, and we see this reflected in the social media. This doesn't translate into power very easily at all. And a lot of that opinion is molded, as we said, by information, disinformation, and propaganda. So I didn't get onto the subject of Japan, but the sentiments against Japan are largely molded by state action. They are artifacts of state propaganda and the state education system, and they reflect the lack of information about that we would regard as knowledge. And that is why merely having pluralized social opinions can cut both ways. It could lead to a hyper-nationalist outcome. If China was made democratic tomorrow, then they might all vote to go to war with Japan. That's something that people discuss. I mean, you don't want rapid anything. Unless there's a learning process which can accompany it. But we see, for example, very significantly this year, that constitutional debate was brought to an end in May. The party organized a kind of a stoppage of the discussion. By the end of the year, I think a very interesting thing happened. It's called the Oxford Consensus, and this was the subject of my paper that I gave in Sydney a couple of weeks ago. Members of the policy intelligentsia went to Oxford in the UK. They signed a declaration. It has almost no political weight or significance. It's done offshore, it's done under foreign auspices, but the people who attended were people who'd never got together before. There was a Confucian liberal, there was a member of the New Left, and there was a kind of Hayekian market liberal. And they signed this thing, and they said that, and they gave a list of points that they want as a value system, which was their version of the Chinese dream. And this statement was, I would paraphrase it as saying, if the state will not form a consensus with society, society will form its own consensus. And we saw through the year, the China Dream was launched as a re-legitimation device. There has been no buy-in from the public. All the commentariat, looking at the third plenum, looking at its political aspects, have basically said the governance model proposed in the third plenum does not allow for public participation. And I can show you that if we had time, I'd show you that in print.
Christine, you want to do?
Just very quickly, on the issue of whether China is going to change, I think having watched the Soviet Union collapse, the Communist Party of China set itself the goal of re-engineering itself to make sure it survives. And it's been very clever in tapping social media. It hires nobody knows how many, tens of thousands of bloggers who send out, party line messages to counter, or in many cases to try to guide the discussion that happens on Chinese Twitter, on Weibo. And these people are paid 50 cents or 50 fen, half a yuan for every blog they send out, so they're called 5毛钱, something.
50 centers.
Yeah, it's 50 centers.
Ladies and gentlemen, you'll all agree that we've had two superb presentations, so please join me in thanking Professor Christine Wong and Professor David Phil.